I'm going to now move to Rebecca, and I'm going to ask Rebecca to first start with perhaps a short reflection. What of the elements that Sylvia just touched upon, which of these do you recognize? Do you also see, hey, I'm also using these type of principles and these type of concepts in the work I'm doing? And then after that, you can proceed also to share with us more details of the work that you're engaged in and how you feel that that's really supporting transformation processes. All yours, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you very much. And can you hear me, Herman?
Loud and clear. Yes,
Okay.
perfectly.
Thank you. So, briefly, I would want to reflect a bit on Sylvia's presentation. While she was presenting, I made quick notes and to my slide, and I think she mentioned about citizen participation and local knowledge, which resonates with my presentation, which I'll be touching on, and also talking about what I can make out of her presentations about transformation entails amplifying the voices that matters, bringing the actual voices that are affected by who is hungry, who is being cheated in the value chain, and so on. And I see that in Bram's presentation when he presented some slides briefly. And also, then the question that came to mind is that when we're talking about the evolving landscape of the food system, how do we optimize which drivers are relevant and necessary to transform the food system? So this afternoon, I shall be sharing, just like Sylvia, my empirical research on local knowledge, different governance systems or approaches that I have used in my research in different contexts, and then we'll discuss forward. So my first presentation on and the use of citizen science approach for co-producing a weather forecast for farming. When I started my PhD research, my focus was on decision making in farming. So when I went to the farmers, I asked them questions about decision making, and then I realized that their I realized that their decision is or their crop pattern is affected by climate change. So I asked, why don't you use the weather forecast for your information to support your decision making? Then they said, when they give us the information, they tell us it will rain today, it doesn't come true. So we use our local knowledge. So this local knowledge existed in the farming communities as stories, oral stories. When we see the birds, we see the ants, and so on. So what did I do? Okay, so to support decision making in farming, I collected these stories in an interview form and now digitalize this information into a web-based app, which you're seeing on the screen. But how do farmers use this web-based app if they do not know how to use a smartphone in the first place? They are used to what we call in Ghana, we call it yam, the very simple phone, we call it yam. So I have to train farmers on how to use the smartphone and how to use the weather app, the web-based app on the left. And so this brought into being co-learning among farmers, young farmers helping or teaching older farmers and women in a group form. They did is, since they said they do not, when they forecast the information, it doesn't come to pass. So we decide, how do you want probability to be communicated to you? So they said, okay, we want to use a circle and a color. When we see this specific color, which you're seeing on my screen, then it tells that, yes, there's a chances that it's going to rain. Now, how did we design this color to? Yeah, their local indicators tells that if they see this frog here, it means, or when the frog start croaking or making noise, it means it's going to rain. So we have the meaning of the indicator. So DS is to send what they have seen today and the probability that it will rain. And then we calculate it. And here, the lower part of this cycle, where my cursor is showing, is the formal scientific forecast coming from GMET. So we also have our cycle. Now, the idea is that at the end of the day, when you see this two cycle, it shows that both sides that says it will rain is relatively close. So it gives confidence for the farmer to make decision. To support their decision making, we give them this rain gauge. Okay, since you said it's going to rain and it's going to rain this amount, you do well by measuring the rainfall, and then we corroborate findings and learn from each other. So there's a WhatsApp chat page where they would post their information. This is what I have seen, just like we are doing in this meeting right now. This is what I've seen. I think it is going to rain. And those who do not even have WhatsApp, because of the training, they could use the audio recording to talk to us and give feedback. At the end of the day, we've learned from each other that no forecasting system is perfect, but to enhance food production in this community, we have to marry the two information systems, because if we rely on one, it may fail. But integrating local forecast and scientific forecast can enhance the skill in the forecast and support decision making and avert crop loss and other challenges that farmers face. I move on to my second presentation, which is also a research that I'm carrying out currently in Kenya and Zambia. So we use the model. Modeling is, people perceive modeling to be very technical. It's about computer, AI, and so on. But we use this model, integrate participatory citizen science approach to it. But albeit the difference between what I presented earlier on and this one is that we engage stakeholders at the national level. So our model, we build scenarios about crop diversification and irrigation. What does it mean if we follow the business as usual scenario of, say, expanding irrigation in Busia County or Laikipia County? Or what does it mean if we want to change from the business as usual scenario of producing maize to maybe producing a crop like, say, would say potato? Or what does it mean? So these stakeholders they come from Kenya. So they tell us, look, this research output, we think that following this pattern will not be appropriate because we live in our country, we know our food system pattern. And also stakeholders also give advice or give implication statement and give guidance that, look, there is a current opportunity for us, we scientists, to feed our research output. So if you see my screen, I had a workshop with stakeholders where we know, for me as a scientist and researcher, when I'm on online, I'll see that we have a NIPE investment plan for maize irrigation and so on, dating 2023 to 2024 or maybe 2030. But when I talk to stakeholders, they tell me, look, and I think most of you can attest to it, we are in our country, we have this written document, but when the president is going to cut a new sword in the village, he pronounces a new policy like, hey, there's a new policy on irrigation. So even with the change of government, there may be a written policy that's planned for 20 years, but with a change of government, the new government and administration will come with a new policy. So they give us ideas on how to integrate our research output to feed into real life policy situation in the countries that I've mentioned. So that's iFeed for you. Now I talk about my research with the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture and Sharm el-Sheikh Joint Work on Agriculture, which is a UNFCCC policy process focusing on agriculture and food system. By the end of this particular slide, you understand why I brought it into discussion about drivers and enablers of food system. The Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture was the first formal UNFCCC decision to recognize the effect of climate change on agriculture, and as well as agriculture's impact on climate change. These run for 4 years, and I followed this research. I did a research on this, and here is a publication. Following the decision then on the joint work, Sharm el-Sheikh Joint Work on Agriculture and Food Security was also adopted at the COP27. Now at COP, decision about food and food security is made by parties, which we call parties, but these are representatives of countries. Now, coalitions are made at a point where groups or countries form groups such as G77 and China, and then the EU and so on. But the reason why I brought this into being is to talk about how decision drives food systems transformation at the global level to the local level, and how the local actors also champion the initiative that we see at COP. So you would see on my screen that there are parties that raise their flag to talk and oppose decisions. And I recall that when the Coronivia joint work on agriculture, the decision was taken, a party refrained from not signing the decision because there was a text. At this stage, countries debate on text. There was a text that implies that smallholder farmers would have to also adopt practices, which Sylvia discussed earlier, adopt practices that would contribute to limitation or contribute to limiting greenhouse gas emission. But this country was of the opinion that it is rather the big farmers who are corporate. So the word smallholder farmer shouldn't be present. Again, I think last year at SB 58, a country which is a developed country will not correlate with other developed countries because they think that agriculture is paramount to their food system development. So they will not even allow any group, they will not join any group to take a decision together. Why is this coming up? It's because as we speak right now, there are coalitions, there are groups that are starting to form in some countries to discuss what the agenda should be when it comes to agriculture and food security, even leading to the UNFCCC level. So there are talks already. So groups collate, and this is me in this picture where I joined a country where we sat to discuss the food systems, our submission of opinion and views. And these opinions and views as citizens at the grassroots level in a workshop somewhere counts very much in a decision that is made at the global level. So these are some of the enablers so far I would discuss. Now I move on to hybrid arrangement. How does hybridity reflect in our food systems transformation? I mentioned multiplicity. Here we see, and I'll mention critical example coming from Ghana. We see that in some spaces, when it comes to food security, we find different actors, non-state and state actors, playing a role to support food supply or food production. And I mentioned the example of the northern region of Ghana, where McNamara mentioned specifically that to support and enhance food security, when you get to that space, or what we call Ghana, northern region of Ghana, there are different NGOs. Once you enter Kintampo, traveling to Tamale, you see different signposts, NGO days. Everyone is trying to support food security, trying to support food production and support poverty reduction in that region. And we also talk about another driver, intertwinement. Here, state actors and non-state actors come together to play a role. Here, there is no formal agreement between these actors, but each of these actors have seen the need to come together to collate, to provide certain services to support food production. And of course, our public-private partnership, which is very evident where government actors and private actors have a stake, and there's a formal agreement. Each party knows how much you bring on board. And then we talk about coalescence, which is another hybrid arrangement that we're seeing. And I mentioned the Harvest Plus initiative in Zambia, where to enhance the adoption of the orange flesh, maize and potato, there's an organization that is formed, that is an entity on its own, formed by different groups, government sector and scientists to enhance adoption of innovation. Now, on my left, I reflect a bit on this, which is a picture I picked from a colleague's thesis. When traveling to the Upper East region, which I talked about, you would see a lot of these signposts about organizations supporting food security. But then we reflect to what extent does this initiative contributing to enhancing food security in these spaces? How do we know that a country or party or an organization A is the one supporting or promoting the initiative? It seems there are good side of it, but there are also implications. There could be duplication of programs and initiatives. And when it comes to accountability, whom do we say is responsible for certain initiative and so on? So there are pros and cons, and this colleague reflect that despite seeing all these signposts and so on in that region, and at this particular time as I speak, in January, February, March, there's no rainfall. And there's this harsh condition where the harvest had for the previous year had already depleted, and there's hunger. So we need to reflect on some of these approaches, multiplicity approaches that we also adopt. I want to talk about my research on ICT, and which Sylvia mentioned earlier on. As we are here, we can see that we are participating in this initiative because of the enablement of ICT and digital technology. And we can mention that Africa or the global south is fast approaching in adoption of digital technologies. And this picture on the right, which you see this woman smiling, is used more often in most development agencies' poster or logo to show that now rural communities and rural farmers are catching up with the rest of the world. They can communicate. But I have a question to ask. We up to now, we can see that the issue of internet and broadband issues have still not been dealt with. Most of you are behind camera because if you try to switch on your camera, then the internet will be unstable. So yes, digital technologies are enablers and drivers of the food systems, but there are still gaps that needs to be reflected upon. Even as there are videos on YouTube to help a farmer, how many farmers can switch on, can go to YouTube and comfortably watch a YouTube video to be able to carry out a farm practice? It is very expensive. It is not affordable. There are internet issues. Even when we talk about farmers having smartphone, as I showed you, how are they able to even identify a downloaded file and send it to an extension officer to say, look at my crops. You are not in that village, but this is a file, this is a picture I have taken. It's difficult even to identify where to some even touch screen and so on. So yes, these are enablers, but there's still gaps that needs to be attended to. Now, I am almost close to my presentation. I look at gender. Sylvia mentioned an issue about gender. And when it comes to the food system transformation, we mentioned women and gender. But this slide is to question our approach of inclusion and inclusivity, especially in the global south. Over time, we've mentioned women, but the question is which aspect of the value chain requires attention when it comes to inclusion of women or men. I give an example about the tomato sector. When looking at this picture, the tomato women or traders are very strong and powerful. If I say powerful, I don't mean physical powerful, but they are able to collate to say, look, this week, this is the price that we are going to fix for the farmers. And no one beats them. And they call them market queen. I will tell you a story about how farmers tried to beat this system and it wasn't successful. And they determine the price of the tomato, the packaging, the payment price. So even when I recall SMV introduced the plastic system for packaging, and these women kicked against it. So till now, you go to Ghana markets, Agbogloshi, Mokola, and you still find this system of packaging of tomatoes. It's because these women have power to determine whether they buy the produce or not. So being able to be champions of tomato prices, these local farmers or the men decided to collate together to transport their tomatoes to the city center to sell, Makola. When they got there, they were met by the market queens. And the market queens said, we have our people who buy tomatoes from the farm. You don't have the right to come here because you are not a trader. So words got out throughout the market and no one bought from these farmers. They struggled to sell their produce, and when they came back, they vowed never to go to Accra to sell. So you would see that in the value chain, some systems, there are some sections of the value chain where women are disadvantaged, and there are some sections in the value chain where men are disadvantaged. I will use this slide where I talk about, we reflect a bit about gender inclusion in the value chain and then the transformation. In some contexts, I would mention another example before reading this quote, and then I end this section. At SB50 meeting, a scientist presented that in some contexts in the global south, even women have access to land more than the men. In some traditions in Ghana, a woman, without the presence of a woman, they cannot even install a chief, which is true. So we need to think about which aspect and which woman is disadvantaged. This quote here is talking about a rural family sharing a well or for irrigation. And the younger farmer, a younger brother, is the one granting the interview. He says, because I'm the youngest in the family, I am the last person to access water from the well. So the elder brothers have access to water. So when you look at this quote, which I try to show here with my cursor, you would even realize that it is not only women who are the disadvantaged, but even in a patriarchal society, there are youths, there are younger ones who are disadvantaged. If you are the last born, you don't get to speak. If you are the last born, you don't get access to extension delivery service. So this brings to the point, my last slide, to say, which woman or which man in the value chain is disadvantaged? And how does our research focus? Are we always following the pattern of saying women, women, and just designing innovation just for women? There's a need for us to look critically at which woman, which of the aspect of the value chain requires attention and requires enhancement or capacity building. And this is my last slide. I look at the top-down approach, the delivery of extension system in Ghana, where the extension system requires home visit, workshop, and field demonstration. With time, this system is evolving by including women. But again, I would want to say that in a household, they select the elderly woman. But we know that there are positions in one household. The households are not homogeneous. In a particular household, every person in that household or individual in that household has their own preference. The man is cultivating watermelon and carrots, but the woman, because of time factor and so on, is cultivating okra and pepper. Similarly, the elderly woman who is invited for this workshop sitting here, there are younger women who are at home, who are rather the ones who go to the farm to till the land. But per class and religion and seniority in the household, they are the ones that are invited for the workshop. So when we talk about enablers to the food systems transformation, we also need to think about our approach, the selection. Even when we are focusing on household, we need to think about the fact that in a single household, there are differences. There are class differentiation. There's even religion. There's even seniority, even among women. So my in-law and she's my in-law. So she goes to a workshop. She's selected because she's the oldest, but she goes to a workshop. And per my relationship with her, I may not be able to access the information. Meanwhile, I am the one who goes to the farm to till the land and bring food to the table. So these are some of the reflections I bring from the field when it comes to enablers and drivers of the food system, while I've also reflected on some of the factors that constrain the transformation. I will end my presentation by saying that we need to look at the trade-offs and the selection of approaches. Some approaches may work in one context or even some section of the value chain, as I've mentioned, but in other section, it may not be applicable. And so we need to look at context-specific approaches. And also we need to look at how we balance power by using group formations, cooperatives, capacity building. And like I mentioned, we need to rethink inclusivity or inclusion. In Europe, inclusion may mean different. And in Africa, inclusion may need to be rethink. The fact that he's a man does not mean he's rich. Maybe it is the elderly man in the village, few elderly men in the village who have all the access, and even maybe the young ones or the young men are struggling. So designing an approach and only focusing on women may end up disadvantaging men, and that is also going to raise crisis for the society. I would want to reflect lastly by saying that we need data. With all these things I'm saying, we need data. How do you know that Nakuru County deserves a project? Are you doing so based on the fact that when you went to the village that day, you saw a young man, as you are seeing, young men struggling to put matoke on a bicycle. So this region deserves to attention. Or you are doing so based on the data. How do you know this family is hungry and they are poor? For the fact that they are not eating on a dining table, so you make an assumption that they are poor. Maybe they are rich and they are eating nutritious food after all. But for the fact that you use your own criteria and judgment, you assume that they are poor and they need an intervention. Perhaps another household that looks healthy in quotes may be needing that intervention. So we need data in the global south when it comes to transformation of the food system, rethinking inclusion, balancing the powers. There's a need for data. I think the developed countries, or I don't want to use the word developed country, the global north has a very good system where even when you enter the country, the system alerts all aspects of subsectors that there's a new person in the system. So we need data as to also transform or build on some of these initiatives. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the facilitators of this program for inviting me to participate in this program and also share my perspective. And I look forward to questions, discussions, debates, and criticisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for a very rich and insightful presentation. You might take some time to follow the chat because also people have been interacting and sharing their praise with what you have presented. Very nice. I think you've challenged us all to rethink our assumptions and to also rethink how some of these food system concepts that we're all becoming very savvy with, that they are one thing when they're a concept, but when you apply this in practice, you really need to get into much more finer details to understand how this concept plays out on the field with the stakeholders that you're involved with. So thanks so much for challenging us in these terms and thinking about inclusion, technology, and how we actually apply these things in